Let's Talk Development, Season 3, Episode 10.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Development, a podcast by the IGC and CDPR. My name is Sajid Faiz, and I'll be the host for the discussion today. I work as an economist for the IGC Pakistan program, where our work focuses on sustainable economic growth through collaboration and engagement with the government and academia. I have with me today Taimur Malik, who is the co-founder of Drawdown Farm, which is an initiative focused on regenerative agriculture and sustainable farming. It's located at the Rahimabad estate in Muzaffargarh. He's also the founder of the Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, a non-profit dedicated to helping smallholding farmers transition to an economically viable and ecologically beneficial agricultural system. Taimur is an expert in regenerative agriculture systems, climate and soil carbon solutions, water-efficient farming in arid regions. And for those who are interested, he's also the co-founder of the prominent coffee chain Drip in Lahore. That's a whole separate conversation altogether for another podcast. But today we'll be focusing the discussion on agriculture and regenerative agriculture. I'd like to begin by learning a bit more about your journey, Taimur. I understand you started your career in investment banking. You were a lifetime ago an analyst at Citibank on Wall Street. What motivated your return to Pakistan, and how did that eventually lead to your interest in regenerative farming? And if you could also tell us a bit more about Drawdown Farm, how was it established, and what its core focus and activities are today?
Sure. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Sajid. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today. So let's get started at the beginning, I guess, of my career, part of life's journey. And it began, as you rightly noted, at Citibank on Wall Street in New York, which was a wonderful experience. In many ways, I learned a tremendous amount, being at such a important and vital institution, and seeing how we live in, essentially, as the Financial Times likes to say, we live in financial times. That's their tagline, and we really do. And so the flow of finance determines so many things. It determines many of the incentive structures, and we'll get to talk about some of those today, and how they relate to agriculture as well. But having that vantage point was extremely valuable. Having said that, after a few years of being there, I realized that something was missing, and it wasn't the most sort of soulful or impactful place to be for me, because I wanted to do something that also had a broader positive impact, right? And I knew that, I don't think I knew that I didn't want to necessarily be, entirely in the public policy world or entirely in the nonprofit world. I wanted to be very much in the world of entrepreneurship or business, but having more impact. And this was a little while back. So this is before the ESG trend, before impact finance and impact investing became a really big thing. And so, those opportunities weren't there as much either. They certainly haven't gone mainstream. And so as I was thinking about what to do, what steps next to take, the opportunity presented itself to be in Pakistan. I decided to take a little bit of a hiatus from life in the US, moved to Pakistan. There was an opportunity to become interim CEO at a textile mill here in the outskirts of Lahore, and it was a spinning mill that I took the reins of at that time, and that was an entirely different arena and ball game. But I learned an enormous amount. I think my regenerative journey sort of begins there, because not too long after I'd taken over, the mill had to temporarily shut down because it wasn't economically viable to keep it running. Now, a spinning mill is it's complex in its own ways, but it's a relatively simple operation in that it's a high volumes, very low margin business. And your two principal costs are, in most cases, energy which is the biggest one, of course, followed by your input cost, which is cotton. And that year, and energy prices, as you know, in Pakistan are always on the higher side of things. And then you also had, cotton, which that year became extremely expensive because Pakistan lost 1/3 of its cotton crop. And that was a huge shock.
Which year was this?
This is circa 2016, right? And as you can imagine, when you lose 1/3 of such a vital commodity, the pricing goes through the roof, which is what happened. A bunch of spinning mills had to shut down. A lot of people, probably in the hundreds of thousands at least, if not more, had to lose their jobs. And it was a pretty cataclysmic event within the textile world. It wasn't as much noticed, I think, outside of the textile arena or the textile business arena in Pakistan, but it really it left huge scars within the textile industry. And there were a lot of people talking about the solutions. What kind of a solution can we orchestrate to rid ourselves of this problem? By the way, this happened because the pink bollworm, which is a pernicious pest of the cotton crop, it sort of devastated a much larger chunk of cotton than it usually does. And so I started sort of peeling the layers of the onion and going deeper into the weeds, pun intended. And I realized that the reason this has happened is because Pakistan was using a genetically modified cotton seed called BT cotton. We were using its older iteration called Bolgard 1. And what had happened was that in the beginning, this BT cotton, so BT is the Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria that's been inserted, in this case, into the, genetically sort of into the cotton crop. And what happens is that when the pink bollworm and certain other pests that, to whom the BT is toxic, when they eat the cotton plant, they sort of die because, the BT is toxic to them. However, so initially it was working really well. But what started happening was that over time, the pink bollworm started developing a resistance. And it came to a point where, it came to a boil essentially in 2016, where a large chunk of the pink bollworm had developed resistance, right? Because essentially the next gen of what is producing of these insects is the one that has developed the resistance. So
it wouldn't die after eating.
It wouldn't die after, and exactly, which is why
it went to town.
It went to town. Where it really did. It had a feast. To the chagrin of the Pakistani economy, and a lot of the conversations that were happening in the textile sector was, okay, we need to upgrade from Bolgard 1 to let's go to Bolgard 3, which was the latest iteration of the GMO cotton crop. And to me, this didn't make much sense because, yes, it's going to work in the beginning, but ultimately after a few years, that too is going to fail because evolution always wins. So whenever you create these reductive approaches, they always ultimately fail because they are temporary fixes as opposed to something that's more, I think, robust. But what was that thing that would be more robust even I wasn't aware of? So then I set myself off into a series of research rabbit holes. I wanted to firstly, one of the questions I was looking at was, how does organic cotton do it? Because I knew from research that organic cotton was increasing year by year, the number of products that were being produced and the just total production, volume production of the crop itself. So how were they making it happen? How could you grow that crop without using either really dangerous pesticides or having BT cotton? And I discovered a study from Madhya Pradesh, India, where they've taken side-by-side farms, certified organic cotton versus a neighboring farmer who is doing BT cotton, right? And they came to the conclusion in the study that a few years after transition to organic, the organic farmer was getting similar yields, same yields as his neighbor who's doing BT cotton, but with much better economics because that farmer does not have to buy expensive pesticides. That farmer is also getting an organic premium on top of that. So it's a double, economic positive whammy. On one side, his expenses are lower. On the other side, he's just getting more for what he's producing.
Is it also less susceptible to sort of like pests and insects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is that the case? And that was my next natural question. Like, how is organic farming doing this, right? And then I came across other research. There was a University of Michigan study which showed that in the global south, where soils are poor, generally speaking, a transition to more agroecological systems, which is another sort of way of saying more regenerative, ecological, biological agricultural systems. When you do that kind of a transition, you often see increases in yields, as high as 30%, right? And that again was a big light bulb moment for me. So not just can you get yield parity, you can actually get higher yields, but how is that possible? So as I delved deeper, I realized that if you create a more systemic framework for agriculture, and this can take many forms and manifestations, but generally speaking, what some of these smallholder organic cotton farmers were doing was they're doing intercropping. They also have higher diversity on the farm itself, more trees, more shrubs. All of that is engendering more beneficial insects, which are keeping the bad guys in balance, right? And nature works in harmony and balance, right? The idea is not to completely eliminate something, but to have enough the predators that you have a system that is in balance and harmony. And that, I think, was a big light bulb moment for me as well. And then I kept going down a series of rabbit holes. Regenerative agriculture was starting to become sort of this movement, very nascent at the time. It's not like the buzzword that it has been for the past few years. But I discovered a bunch of literature, emerging literature, some case studies, some scientific studies on regenerative agriculture. And again, how do you do this? How do you work with biology? How do you create ecological systems that help a farmer achieve the outcomes that a farmer wants, right? What are the outcomes that a farmer wants? A farmer wants enhanced yields. A farmer wants reduced incidences of pests and disease attacks. And in some cases, better quality of the produce that you're growing, right? Because it depends, again, crop to crop, but for many crops, you're paid for the quality. If you're growing apples or oranges, mostly the case for fruits and vegetables, part of what you're paid for, it's not just the weight, but it's also the quality. And so these are the, factors that a farmer is looking to enhance. And as I dug deeper, I realized that regenerative agriculture has the potential to enhance all of these factors on a farm. But a lot of this stuff was very nascent. None of it had been done in our part of the world. And that's when I was sort of, bitten by the bug, if you will. And I realized that this is something that I can be very passionate about. And as I was still, I knew that the textile mill was always going to be an interim arrangement, stepping stone to me figuring out what is it that I really want to do. And in this time, I discovered that this, I think, is the thing. I was also very wary of the climate crisis and, emerging research on the biodiversity crisis. There was a study that came out, it was labeled by the popular media as Insect Armageddon, which showed that Europe had lost a whopping 75% of its insect populations over the past 25 years, right? This, I think, study came out in 2017. And that was all, truly stunning. And Europe, by the way, has
So do you think the numbers are lower in Pakistan or higher?
They could be. I think they're probably much higher because Europe has very high regulation, right? If Europe allows maybe 300, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, biocides, the US allows 1,200. And in Pakistan, you don't really have
regulation.
There's no regulation. Essentially, it's a very laissez-faire. Like, as an economist, you appreciate this quip, but, when people, libertarians in the US, etc., they talk about, oh, we want this laissez-faire economy and society. I often tell them, well, you should visit Pakistan and see what that does, right, to a society. Europe, on the other hand, has lots of regulations. And whether that's for chemical usage, whether that's for cutting and felling trees, the whole shebang. In Pakistan, you have a massive deforestation crisis. You don't really have regulation about the kind of chemicals that are used. And so I suspect that it's actually much higher. And we can intuitively kind of gauge this. When I was a child in the 1990s, there were so many insects that we would just have, in our backyards. Dragonflies galore, ladybugs, like all of these things that nowadays you hardly, if ever, see. I have not seen a dragonfly in Lahore in the past, I don't know, decade and a half, right? Whereas when I was growing up, they were everywhere. They were everywhere when we'd been in Karachi, Lahore, everywhere. Today, I only find dragonflies when I go on our farm, right? Knock on wood. And it makes me very happy, takes me back to my childhood. By the way, dragonflies are amazing for the ecosystem. We have a dengue crisis in this country, and dragonflies are voracious eaters of mosquitoes. Everything has a purpose, right? We have this proliferation of mosquitoes, for instance. If you had the right kind of checks and balances that nature's given, you probably wouldn't have nearly the kind of scale of the crisis that we today have. So again, going back to these discoveries, which were extremely disturbing, I realized that regenerative agriculture can be a solution to so many of these problems, because you'll have much higher biodiversity. There was emerging research showing that if 50% of global farmland did regenerative organic type of agriculture, we could sequester enough carbon in soils to reverse climate change. Which again, we're not just talking about, let's mitigate the risk of climate change, let's adapt to it. We're talking about reversing climate change, right? And that was very exciting because as the the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, the world, had not begun to appreciate the scale of the crisis. But I had just discovered I happened to read Earth, which is EWRTH, the book by Bill McKibben, famous environmental journalist, which, I think went into a great deal of depth of the science of climate change. And I realized that I think everybody's very chill about this because, the Syrian civil war, for instance, happened because of, in at least in large part because of climate change as one of the catalysts that made it happen. The floods in Pakistan in 2010, extremely devastating, left 20 million people homeless. Also, climate change had a big role to play in it. The Arab Spring, indirectly, was instigated again in part by climate change, because in 2010 you had major heat waves, which caused the floods in Pakistan, but also caused forest fires in Russia, which impacted the wheat yields in Russia, which led to a temporary export ban by the Russians, which meant that countries that were importing wheat, such as Egypt, and then subsidizing that wheat to keep the population pacified, bread and circuses, the bread part of that, they could no longer afford to do so because wheat prices globally escalated. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back and pushed people into Tahrir Square, which led to, the Arab Spring or winter as it ultimately became. So, and if you look at Syria, in between 2006 and 2010, the worst drought in Syria's recorded history happened, which led to, I think, 60% crop failures, 80% livestock deaths, pushing 2 million farmers to cities where there were no jobs or services waiting for them. And it was a tinderbox sort of waiting to explode. And that's what ultimately happened. People started protesting. And authoritarian government was extremely heavy-handed with them. But people had nothing to lose. And that entire country essentially blew up into a civil war, which thankfully has recently come to an end. But I've realized that this global warming has already begun, and we're not even close to the 1.5 degrees or the 2 degrees guardrail that the climate, that the Paris Agreement has mandated upon the world. And so this is a serious crisis, and we need to start reversing the worst effects of it. So all of these exciting things meant that I realized that this was my calling in life. Now, the only question was how to figure out, where to farm, because I don't come from a farming background. And that's where I was lucky enough to partner with the Thal Industries, who have farmland in southern Punjab in a very brittle desert environment in the Thal Desert. And we set about in creating a truly revolutionary, highly innovative, bleeding edge kind of an agricultural system, marrying the best of various technologies. Some of them were explicitly regenerative, some of them agnostic to the agronomic system, whether it's regenerative or not so regenerative, such as high efficiency irrigation systems, center pivots, drip irrigation, impact sprinklers, and the like, hose reels and the like, right? So that's how sort of the German journey began. We began the farming system in 2017.
At the time, was this a completely novel concept in Pakistan, or were you inspired by others who, taken up similar efforts?
Yeah, no, it was completely novel. Nobody had done sort of regenerative agriculture. Some people were tinkering with conservation agriculture, which is basically like no movement towards no-till. But even that stuff was extremely limited and not very professionally done. Again, everybody was experimenting, trying to figure out how to make this work. And in terms of regen ag, nobody had heard the term. It was completely novel. And so we were sort of, pioneers in that. And I'm very grateful that we sort of have that mantle. And so, hence began the journey. We began with some very small, very radical experiments where we were like, we're going to say, we're going to go cold turkey, no fertilizers, no obviously other chemical inputs, no biocides.
And what sort of crops were you mostly focusing on at the time?
We started with, because we took an existing farmland,
Okay.
which was growing a few types of crops. It was growing some wheat. It was growing some sugarcane, a fair amount of sugarcane actually. It had some orchards of mango and citrus. And so we wanted to, and we was growing fodder crops. So we thought, we'll work with the same crops that are being grown here. But
What was the size at the time of the farm?
So at the time, the farm had an acreage under cultivation, maybe of, dare I say, not more than 200 acres, probably about 150 acres. But over time, we expanded the acreage, which already existed as part of the farm, but we didn't have the water resources and had not sort of developed it, including land development. But over time, as we transitioned the entire farm, so when I joined this operation, there was zero high efficiency irrigation systems. But then we ultimately, slowly but surely, transitioned. Almost the entire farm at this point is under high efficiency irrigation. We have very little, maybe about 5% flood irrigated. 95% of the farm now is under high efficiency irrigation systems, which is great. For example, we now grow sugarcane that saves, as per, we brought in professors from BZU, Bahauddin Zakaria University, and they did an analysis that we save about at least 75% water in growing sugarcane compared to flood irrigated sugarcane in our region, in our sandy soils, right? And that's a huge benefit. So, so the scope is enormous for all sorts of interventions. Some of them highly technical, some of them more biological focused. But either way, the core conclusion we've reached almost a decade after we began is the potential for transformation is truly profound. Having said that, our earlier experiments, a lot of them were, quite significant failures. Thankfully, they were small, they were contained, but we learned an enormous amount from them. And we kept learning, kept innovating, kept going to different global experts, learning things, translating them into our context, and then sort of implementing them at scale as we proved, the thesis.
Right. So that was quite fascinating, your journey from, what sort of started off as like an interim role, and then that sort of led you to sort of find your real calling, right? But I want to sort of transition towards, the agriculture system in Pakistan as a whole, right? So 23% of our GDP is in agriculture. Around 40% of the labor force is involved in agriculture. Yet productivity in the agriculture system, it remains below potential. The numbers for wheat yields, you can see they're sort of declining if we compare ourselves with India. So for us, I think the numbers around, on average, 3 tons per hectare. And in India, it's somewhere closer to 5 or even 6 maybe. You can see in reports, research done by people like Dr. Abid Barki, they can show that, total factor productivity is really declining in Pakistan's agriculture sector. He's written about that in the World Bank Country Economic Memorandum, which is, I think, is released around 2022. That paired with, climate vulnerability in Pakistan. We saw in the 2022 floods, the total damage, economic and losses was close to around $30 billion in GDP. Temperatures are rising. I think around the numbers are what the Ministry of Climate Change has to say is that the last century, they've gone up by around half a degree Celsius. And projections suggest that, rising temperatures could will cause wheat and rice yields to plummet even further. So within this sort of framework, right, and within what you're doing at Drawdown Farms, what can be done in the mainstream sort of agriculture system in Pakistan to make it sort of more resilient to sort of these climate shocks and declining productivities that we're facing?
Yes, a great question, and certainly one that requires a robust answer. Firstly, in terms of yields, yes, in Pakistan, and India, actually, farmers. Well, India is a bit different. They do quintals more there, but in Pakistan, in particular, most yield is measured in mons. So I was doing a quick back of the envelope calculation, and you're right, it's 3 tons per hectare, which is basically 30 mons per acre. That is the average yield in Pakistan. But that's for, the entirety of the country. If we look at places like southern Punjab, it further plummets. There are parts in southern Punjab, really sandy soils. People are getting even 20 mons per acre, right? 25 mons per acre. And so there is huge scope for improvement. And one of the problems, I think, is that our agronomic system is very limited and very outdated. We are stuck, I often like to say this, we are stuck in a 1960s Green Revolution paradigm, and we haven't really come out much from there. Let's even park regenerative agriculture and other newfangled things to the side for a second. Even within more, call it mainstream or more chemical-oriented agronomy, there's been a huge there have been huge leap forwards over the many decades since the Green Revolution first took place in the 50s and 60s, globally speaking. But in Pakistan, we are largely still in the midst of practices that were inculcated in that time. Heavy tilling, certain dwarf seed varieties, for example, for wheat, and predominantly deploying urea, so nitrogen fertilizer, and for phosphorus, DAP, diammonium phosphate, and both of which we deploy in a terrible manner. Diammonium phosphate, by the way, I'm going to go into a little digression here, but a valuable one given the topic we're discussing. Diammonium phosphate is a fertilizer that doesn't make sense for this country. It's an imported fertilizer. We import possibly about $1 billion worth. It's extremely expensive. In 2021, one 50 kg bag cost somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 rupees. So let's say on average 5,500. Today, that same bag costs us about 14,500 to 15,000. It's extremely expensive, and it's extraordinarily wasteful and inefficient. It is a highly alkaline fertilizer. And in our country, we today have a problem.
Soil is alkaline to begin with.
Highly alkaline. Our soils are not just alkaline, they're highly alkaline, right? And they've become even more alkaline, significantly more alkaline over the past few decades because of our practices, heavy tilling, the kind of fertilizations we're using, not building soil, not having soil organic matter or a soil food web, a living ecosystem within the soils that modulates pH. Well, and by the way, pH is logarithmic. So whereas maybe back in the day pH was 7.5, today there are farms reaching 8.5, 8.4, 8.3. It's very common. And the difference between 7.5 and 8.5 is not your plain vanilla, sort of linear difference. This is a logarithmic difference. So every 0.1 difference is huge. It has huge ramifications for nutrient reuse efficiency, and therefore it produces a huge yield drag. right? So that's very important to understand. So diammonium phosphate, there are international agronomists I've spoken to mention that there are studies that showcase that maybe in some cases as low as 8% of DAP is taken up by the plants, right? In any case, this number does not exceed 20%, right? So somewhere between 8 and 20% of what you are applying is being used. So for their crops in this country where farmers are deploying 2 bags of urea, let's take a 15,000 rupee price, so 30,000 rupees of that, maybe somewhere around 3,000 to a maximum of 6,000, right? So under less than 3,000 to maximum 6,000 rupees of that is being utilized. The rest is all getting wasted. It gets fixed in the soil. So we're using really the wrong kinds of fertilizers. We are not utilizing some fertilizers which we should be, right? The usage of potassium, and this is something that's quite fairly recognized, amongst more progressive type of farmers. So, and even amongst policymakers, etc. Potash usage in this country is extremely low and should increase because it's super critical to a lot of crop functions, right? But what is not recognized is the role of many micronutrients. So when we began our journey, and especially when I started getting very razor focused on micronutrients as well, many years ago, I realized that the Pakistani marketplace does not even have many micronutrients which are essential to getting the kind of optimal outcomes we want. And I'm not just talking about yields, although yes, check mark to yields, but specifically resistance to diseases and pests. And this is something that many people find quite befuddling, but we have copious amounts of research today across all biological species that the role of nutrients is super critical in building immunity. Why? Because these nutrients, a lot of them are enzyme cofactors, without which various enzymatic reactions cannot take place in the body, which means that biological species is underperforming. So while we have some basic micronutrients available in this country, you'll have zinc and boron and some others, not very high quality versions of things like copper or iron or manganese. You'll hardly find a few products, but there are many other micronutrients, molybdenum, cobalt, which just don't exist in this country, right? And these, by the way, are now recognized by the International Fertilizer Institute as absolutely essential. Silicon is another one. And so without these, you can never get the kind of positive outcomes or transformation for agriculture that we want, right? Yes, there's systemic elements. We'll get to that. Carbon, adding organic matter, having farming systems that naturally build and sort of regenerate organic matter, such as no-till systems. All of that is super critical. But nutrients are also super critical. So again, going back to the fundamental point I was trying to make, we are still stuck in an agronomic system that is decades old, and that needs to be rectified. And of course, it's sort of like, well, if cell phones are now cheap and can be assembled at scale, we don't need land lines, right? So we can skip some of the steps that have come in the middle. We can now move towards a modern regenerative system that limits the amount of synthetic chemistry that we need to apply, especially biocides, pesticides and fungicides in particular. If you create the kind of systems that are very biologically efficient and create resilient, strong plants, you don't need pesticides and fungicides as much. In fact, I can foresee a world, and I can foresee it not taking even too long, where you can be 99% free from pesticides and fungicides.
Right. So you also wear the hat of the Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. So I'm sure with that, there must be some engagement with maybe government and the donor sector. So in order to get these sort of changes enacted, with getting the right sort of fertilizer coming in, getting the right sort of nutrients in our soil, what are the primary stakeholders that need to be brought on board? Is it mostly government decisions, or does this involve engagement with the private fertilizer sector, or is this a demand issue? And regardless of what you supply to the farmers, they're going to pick with what they know rather than experiment with their, precious land on what sort of fertilizer to use on their crops?
A fantastic question. So, firstly, the Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture is a very new and nascent organization, and we are still getting the boots off the ground, so to speak. But the goal remains, as you very kindly mentioned in your introduction as well, to abet smallholder farmers in enhancing their yields and economic viability, while also enhancing the ecological functioning of farmland. And at scale, this can have enormous positive ramifications for Pakistan. We can start to shift our hydrological cycle positively, which can break, heat wave, cloudburst type events. So there are lots of positive externalities that can come out of this. Now, to your question about who are the stakeholders that we want to engage with and have started to engage with. So I think and all of the above is the short answer. We need the private sector as well involved, in particular, industry that has an agricultural footprint. So that could be a rice mill, textile, that have big agricultural footprints. Lots of industries that are in food processing, right? So if you are procuring corn and making whatever, corn meal or corn flakes or whatever out of it, corn oil, all of those types of industries that have a big ag footprint, I think it's vital for them to move further upstream and to work towards ensuring better climate resilience for that system, but also better insulating themselves in terms of ensuring supply chain sustainability, access to inputs for their sort of industrial operations. Now, so that's the private sector.
And just to build on, it's not. There's also a sort of incentive driving that change, especially for those industries which are looking towards export markets.
Yes.
For example, in Europe, the textile industry, they're struggling to meet, the CBAM regulations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's sort of really given an impetus into, sustainable and sort of resilient farming practices.
Precisely. And we are in touch with a few progressive textile groups, large ones who are essentially export oriented, and they're very interested in joining us and supporting the work we do. So I'm very much looking forward to, we're enacting a bunch of trials this year. We're looking to creating a small farmer field school, the first of its kind, and we hope of many more to come, which will teach farmers practices that are both ecologically beneficial but also economically very beneficial for them. And so a series of trials have been planned for 2026, and we hope that we can demonstrate those results with various, small and medium type of farmers. We also did some work with the Ministry of Planning and Development and the Planning Commission. And in the budget for this year, for 2026, there was a regen ag sort of trial that has been slated. There hasn't been sort of progress yet on the trials happening. It's a series of trials in different agroecological regions of Pakistan in all provinces for all of our major crops. The idea being that we want to demonstrate comprehensively the benefits of this type of regenerative system that we're designing, which will enhance yields. We hope to enhance nutritional density because we have obviously a massive stunting and malnutrition crisis in this country. One of the causes, there are a myriad of causes. One of the causes is that the staple foods we eat, for example, wheat, has lower nutrition than what it should have. So, for example, have lower amount of zinc or lower amount of boron. And these things are fixable, and they're fixable at a lower cost, and it has to do with the way we farm, right? So part of it is engaging with the government. Ideally, we'd want to engage with, because agriculture has now become a provincial domain, we want to engage with the provincial ag departments and ministries and really help them craft systems that can be completely transformational. Also work with the extension services, which are essentially the government arm that goes and teaches farmers what to do and how to do it, which I think need to be massively revamped and rehauled and made fit to purpose for the 21st century. I think that is the Achilles heel in some ways of agriculture in Pakistan. And this leads to the third point, because you asked about, farmers. What's the incentive for a farmer to change, right?
It's the demand side of it.
Exactly. And I think there isn't much in some ways. In some ways there is, because the farmer is very tired of the status quo. The farmer is not being able to make, generally speaking, ends meet. And the economic situation for farmers in this country is, generally speaking, quite precarious. There are exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, it's very up in the air. They're not in a happy place. The input prices, I just mentioned DAP a little while earlier, and that's just one of many. Input prices are through the roof. What they're getting in return for their produce does not compensate for it. And so
That's especially true for smallholding farms.
And especially true for smallholders, right? And so they are in dire straits. And in a situation like that, they cannot take risks. They do not have the luxury of failure. And they also don't have the knowledge to do it in a safe and productive way. So the kind of strategies that I advocate for smallholder farmers who are first making the jump towards regen ag, they are not advanced practices, right? I give the example very often. I do it in international podcast appearances that I've had the pleasure of being on as well, and a lot of people get a kick out of it. But it is quite, it's a very accurate analogy. If anybody wants to learn a martial art, let's say karate or taekwondo, you cannot become a black belt overnight. You will have to start, at the beginning as a white belt and then a yellow belt. You have to earn your right and move up the ladder. And that's the case also with agriculture, and especially regenerative agriculture. You start with the lowest hanging fruit, the things that give the highest ROI and the best bang for buck, and that give you a return for crop number one. About maybe 3 years ago, there was a BCG study, which I have a huge beef with. And that study said that regen ag, it was in a certain context in the US, in the sort of probably the Great Plains type of area, the corn and soy belt zones of the US. And it talked about how regen ag ultimately becomes profitable, but in the first few years, it takes 3 to 5 years for the transition. And in the beginning, the farmer needs financial support.
Now, and research suggests that farmers, they're unwilling to sort of adapt new practices unless they give results within the first 2 seasons.
Absolutely.
So those are the two is the number we have.
Yeah.
So how do we, in that sort of structure, in promote regenerative agriculture?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we do it in a way by not focusing on those practices which are longer gestational, right? I think those come later. You have to focus on the practices that start giving you results from the get-go. So, I mentioned nutrients earlier. So nutrients are also essential. So, zinc or cobalt, for example, is also essential for microbes. So, we have this perception that fertilizer is bad. It's bad for soil. It's bad for plants. And that's not true. I think it's what type of fertilizer. There's a lot of nuance there. There are fertilizers that are accretive to soil health, and there are fertilizers that are dilutive to soil health. Urea, especially the way we deploy in this country, is dilutive to soil health. It can destroy microbes. DAP is dilutive to especially DAP. I'm not saying all phosphatic fertilizer. There are phosphatic fertilizers that can be good for soil and for many microbes, right? Because everything needs these elements, including the tiniest critters which we cannot see with our naked eyes, right? And that's what makes soil become an engine of climate resilience, of higher yields, of better pest and disease resistance for crops, et cetera, right? And that's all possible when you have higher organic matter and when you have a living soil food web. So lots of different consortia of microbes, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, archaea, nematodes, et cetera, microarthropods, in the soil, right? And everything eats each other and poops, and all of that poop, microbial poop, is rich in highly bioavailable nutrients, right?
But the basic level is about fixing the food chain which is going on in the soil.
In the soil, right? Exactly. But the part of that food chain, some of it is systemic. You need to stop tilling, which is horrendous for soil microbiome, right? For the hidden half of nature, which is really in the soil. But part of it is also providing them, the food sources, the prebiotics, the nutrients that they need to thrive as well. And when they thrive, the crops you grow in that soil thrive, right? So coming back again to your main question, which was a very valuable one, what are the kind of practices, or how do we do this transition in a way where a farmer is easily adopts these practices? And I think that has to be practices that start giving a result from crop one. Because even with 2 seasons, I don't think most farmers are going to go for 2 seasons. They just don't have the economic backbone in this country to be able to do so. So you have to give them a result from crop number one. And that's why the kind of systems that sort of we design, whether it's on our own farming operation, but also with the Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, where we specifically focus on smallholders, those are all the practices that start giving you results from crop number one, right? At least in the beginning, that's what we want. Ultimately, we also want some other practices so that the process of regeneration continues, and those are longer gestational kind of results. But what would some of these practices, for example, look like? I can give a couple of examples, but it's a long litany. One of them could be an appropriate biostimulant, and this could even be a biostimulant made on the farm. So moringa, sohanjana in Urdu, is a native tree, extremely beneficial. It's been called the Swiss Army knife of trees, extremely beneficial for human health, for animal health, but also for plant health. So you can make, even a smallholder farmer can make a biostimulant out of, crushed moringa leaf, and, mix it into water, and you can do a seed treatment before you apply the seed in the soil. You can later on in the season, especially if you have an adverse, but even preempting any kind of adverse sort of
The sense I'm getting is you get the buy-in from the farmer using interventions which sort of have a limited downside.
Yes,
Before
essentially no downside.
telling him, hey, the fertilizer you're using, it's messing up the soil. Maybe try this.
So change your fertilizer regime and paradigm. Yes, exactly. So the lowest hanging fruits where there is no down risk, right? That's exactly what we want to focus on.
Yeah, great. So I'm being told we have limited time left, so I'm going to focus on 2 more questions.
Sure,
right?
of course.
The first one, right? So, Drawdown Farms, it says that it's converting desert sand into living productive soil, right? I want to get a bit into what you mean when you say this. I understand that a lot of it has to do with the organic carbon level in the soil. Pakistan has apparently, lost a lot of organic carbon in the soil due to intensive tillage and monocropping. And the FAO has flagged that nearly 70% of Pakistan's land is affected by some form of soil degradation. So when you say that, you're converting desert sand into living productive soil, what are you exactly doing?
Yeah, so we are, again, we take a very integrative, very advanced practitioner sort of view of regenerative agriculture, right? Because we've earned that right, having been doing this for about a decade. And the mixture of practices that we do, which includes cover crops, no-till tillage systems, sometimes intercropping, depending crop to crop.
What's a no-till tillage system?
Yeah, so no-tillage is, so this is actually very important for a conversation on regen ag. It's in some ways it is at the heart of it, or one of the elements that's at the heart of it. Since man invented agriculture 10,000 years ago or so, by some counts in this part of the world where Pakistan exists today, we had to do something that was very destructive, which was tilling the land, making it soft so that you could apply seeds, so that the seeds could better grow and take root, right? But that process of tilling, which of course back in the day was done via oxen, and horses in some cultures, so different parts of the world, but different animals essentially were, you had these tillage metal which was behind an animal, and the draft animal was essentially pulling it, and it was ripping the soil, destroying the soil, but also softening the soil temporarily for each season, and then you plant the seeds. Now, humans had no other recourse. And there's a fantastic book that I urge everybody to read. It's called Dirt and the Erosion of Civilization by Professor David Montgomery. I've met David, and we've hung out as well. He's a fantastic writer and researcher. And he shows that every single great civilization known to man got destroyed, at least in part because its soils got destroyed and eroded. Whether that was ancient Egypt, whether that was Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, etc., etc. They exhausted the soil with decades upon decades of tillage in the same area, right? Because what is civilization? You're staying put in the same area, using the same sort of land to grow food. Populations keep on increasing with time. And ultimately, there comes a point where the soil is so dramatically eroded that there's a huge production dip in one cycle, and suddenly you have a famine-like situation. And humans had no recourse to this until, frankly, around about the 1980s, when the first modern no-till machinery was invented. Now, there are exceptions to this. The Native Americans in the U.S. had found ways to plant things without having to till soil, and they were usually planting consortia, so intercropping, which was keeping the soil very moist and very pliable, very friable, very soft. So and they were using sort of sticks in some cases to poke in seeds. So they've created a nice invented system. Their population sizes were very low. They were not the kind of like mass scale sort of civilizations that you found in other parts of the world, whether in Asia, Africa, Europe, or even Southern America. So the natives of Northern America were a bit different, but mostly everybody else had to till. Until the 1980s, when the first no-till machinery was made. And as with all technologies, you look at solar panels from the 1980s to solar panels today, they've improved tremendously. So is the case with no-till machinery. Today, we have some amazing cutting-edge equipment being made by some of the industrial powerhouses of the world. So on our farm, we have a European no-till machine. And what we do is, without having to rip or till the soil, the machine goes in, it literally creates sort of a little slit in the soil and drills in the seed at the exact depth you want, which is also, ideal for the kind of, yield outcomes you want, because you want the seed to be at the exact depth for the crop you're growing. And then you also want the plant to plant distance to be accurate. You want the row to row distance to be accurate. And the right kind of equipment allows us to do that. So,
And we have similar mechanisms for fertilizer as well.
You can.
Alternatives to, just broadcasting.
Yes, of course. You can. So with a lot of these impressive modern seed drills, you can also have liquid or physical fertilizer boxes that it's called banding. They band the fertilizer, which means that under your seed, they will also drop fertilizer. So that's much, much more efficient. And especially if you use the right kind of fertilizer that's also not bad for soil, that's actually good for the soil or can improve soil, it's an ideal win-win combination. So we use that. We use cover crops, which means that when we're not growing a crash crop, we're growing a consortia, a mixture of a polyculture of different sort of seeds and crops. Then we have animals graze them. In some cases, we intercrop crops. So, for example, we've done sunflower intercropped with sugar canes with excellent results. And sunflower is an excellent crop in that it also is really good for the soil. It helps build mycorrhizal fungi, which are a crucial keystone fungal species, very good for soils, very good for plant health and yields, etc. And so we deploy a range of these types of techniques, and because of that, we've seen in many areas of our farm where what looked like peat sand from Hawke's Bay, Karachi, now looks like this chocolate brown, very deep, beautiful soil. And we know that it's living because the fungal to bacterial ratios have completely transformed. We've tested them under microscopes and under various kits that we have for soil testing, for microbial soil testing. So we know that there's a living soil food web, and of course you wouldn't have that kind of carbon buildup without having a living soil. So just intuitively we know this, but also we've tested some of these things out. So to answer your question, in summary, that is how we've been able to achieve. And for different crops, we have different systems, slightly tweaked systems. It's not a one size fits all. For our orchard crops, we have a different system, because they are perennials. They exist, all year round. For semi-perennials like sugarcane, we have a different system. For annual crops such as wheat or maize, it's a different system. So we have different, slightly tweaked systems, but broadly, all of them are highly biological, highly ecologically sensitive, and therefore very regenerative.
Right. So I want to conclude by inviting some of your views on the topic of water, right? Now, water is a topic which frankly warrants a whole podcast of its own. But since we're talking about agriculture, I don't think we can end the discussion without bringing water into the conversation. So water, I think, more than 90% of the freshwater supply in Pakistan gets used for agriculture and farming. FAO and World Bank, they all suggest that Pakistan is either water stress or on the path to becoming water scarce. You mentioned that at your farm, you're incorporating, water efficient practices which are, use water more efficiently for farming. How can that sort of stuff be scaled at, across the country to make water usage more efficient?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And water is a tougher pickle to resolve. Technically easy, but I think there are many different layers, and it also has to do with the sort of economic milieu and social economic conditions in our country. So I'll begin with talking about soil. So one can literally, or especially I could speak for hours on end about soil. But one of the other benefits of having soil organic matter is that every 1% of organic matter that you add to an acre lends to about 30,000 gallons, which is about 104,000 liters of water storage per acre. Every 1% of organic matter you add. Today, our soils on average in this country have 0.3% organic matter, right? It's declined significantly from the 0.5 to 1% it used to be. It's now 0.3%. On our farms in the Thal Desert, it's generally 0%, right? Because it's pure sand where we are at. And that's part of it, I think, of reducing water usage is building soil. I think that's super critical. This country needs to have a mission soil, a North Star towards building soil. That's what everybody needs to be working on for all of the many different reasons, including enhancing yields, enhancing climate resilience. But so one of the things is like soil health. Then you have more technical sort of agronomic interventions. These would be how we water different crops. In a lot of cases, we are overwatering, right? Even with our flood irrigation paradigm, which by itself is very wasteful, flood irrigation. But even within flood irrigation, there are ways to, reduce the amount of water we're using by designing farms better and deploying water when it's absolutely needed the most, as opposed to, farmers just being, not very thoughtful about how they water. So that's another aspect, right? And I think also as you build soil, farmers will be able to see, oh, look, my topsoil has more water. It is more moist, so maybe I don't need to waste water, right? I think and a lot of people talk about this, the solar revolution is actually not a very good thing because it now incentivizes farmers. You've got free, you don't have to pay for diesel, just turn the taps on for your underground motors and you flood irrigate. So I think part of it is just sharing that knowledge, making farmers realize that this is it's a crime against society. It's morally wrong. It's spiritually wrong, right? There's a lot of actually Islamic literature that
you can actually leverage that.
Yes,
social
exactly. I think it's super critical. And so, lastly, the last leg of this is deploying these technologies, so drip irrigation or impact sprinklers. Center pivots, I think, don't make sense in Pakistan because it's all smallholders, so you can't really do it. It does make sense for the few large holders, but for smallholders, it doesn't. But drip and impact sprinklers, I think, make a lot of sense, or even hose reels, especially in more clay type of soils, such as your Dipalpur belt. I met a gentleman who grows about 150 acres of potato, 150, 200 acres, and he has moved his entire operation to hose reel based irrigation. And these irrigation reels or hose reels are saving him about 40% water because in those clay soils that he has, there's also there's a good amount of water holding capacity anyway. And so I think, so different these high efficiency irrigation technologies for different zones and soil types in the country are a huge boon. What they also do allow farmers to do, most of these high efficiency irrigation systems, is you can also microdose fertilizers and biologicals, by the way, a compost extract, a biostimulant, a prebiotic for the soil. And what that does is that your nutrient use efficiency goes up, the amount of fertilizer you need to deploy, it gets reduced, you're able to build soil. And so not just are you saving water, with drip systems, you can easily save 50 to 60% water, again, depending what type of soil you have. In sandy soils, you can even save 75% water. But and not just are you doing that, you are also delivering nutrients in the root zone where they are needed, and you're microdosing, right? What happens? What is the status quo in this country? Farmer's going and he's just doing what's called chatta, right? Broadcast applications of urea or DAP or some other fertilizers, which are highly inefficient. They're not getting to the root zone. They're just being spread around willy-nilly. And also when you mix things in and you use water-soluble fertilizers, you're mixing them in water, they're just much more efficient. So I think, but this requires a whole of government and whole of society approach. Yeah. This is not an easy fix, but it is fixable.
There's a lot of inertia.
There's a lot of inertia. Yeah. We have enough water in this country. Let me tell you that. This I firmly believe. If we tackle this over a decade seriously as a country and a society, we have so much water in this country. We are blessed with abundant water that we have millions of acres in this country that today are largely wastelands, are not being deployed and utilized properly. We can utilize them for agriculture while enhancing our yield. So we can reduce water while enhancing yields, while enhancing climate adaptation and resilience, and even enhancing the bounty, ecological bounty and biodiversity in our country, changing the hydrological cycles. All of this can be done if we become serious.
Thank you, Taimur. It's been a pleasure having you on this podcast. Thank you also for the reading list you've given to me and the viewers of this podcast. And I'd like to thank the listeners, and we'll compile the books that Taimur has mentioned in the description below. And stay tuned for the next episode of Let's Talk Development.
Please subscribe so you never miss a podcast, and comment below who you would like to see next.